Well, let's begin. We today have a presentation on the Nolen plan, which you'll find out a lot more about, but I'm just going to say it was in 1909 when there was a look at how we were going to make Montclair as beautiful as it could possibly be. And that's sort of the impetus for it all. I want to mention that in 2 weeks, our matinee program is not at 12 o'clock. This is Montclair in the Ice Age, which should be lots of fun. It's a professor at Montclair State, but he's not available until 1 o'clock. So mark on your calendar that it's 1 o'clock, not 12 o'clock in 2 weeks. If you're more than 20 miles away, you know that if you could put that in the chat, I'd appreciate it. If you're watching with more than 2 people on the screen, if you could put that in the chat, that would be great. If you don't want your little thumbnail to show up, please do me a favor and hide your video when we start, because I do record these. Even Helen's, I know last week there were some problems with the afternoon programming, but it's now available on our YouTube channel, so you can see it there. And I want to mention, of course, that we always appreciate your support, and you can do that with Venmo. You can do it on our website. You can do it with a check. You can do it any number of ways. Stop by and say hello too. We're going to be open most of December for the holiday house tours. I'm very excited about that. So you can stop in and see us then as well. I'm going to now introduce Kathleen Bennett, who's going to be talking about the Nolen plan. Kathleen really became immersed in the arts after graduating with a BA in fine arts. She moved to Montclair, and then she bought, like so many of the folks in Montclair, bought a 19th century house, and that sort of deepened her interest in the architecture and culture of that period. So she became involved in the local Victorian Society in America, the Northern New Jersey chapter. She was president and program chairperson there for a while. And then she began doing a little more in-depth studying, first with the Historic Preservation Certificate Program at Drew. And then she went on for her master's in decorative arts at Cooper Hewitt. And so she really has got quite a bit of knowledge under her belt. She's also chairperson of the Historic Preservation Commission, not to be confused with the History Center. And with that is one of 3 land boards in the town. And she's also working on a historic structures report in Caldwell. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen so that she can share her screen and start the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. This is the second time I'm doing this about the Nolen plan. The first time I spoke to the Montclair History Center on this was about 5 years ago. And it was really through that talk and doing the research for that talk that I became involved. I became a member of the Historic Preservation Commission in Montclair. And I just wanted to preface this talk today with telling everybody that this is not I'm not critical about the planning board by any means. I really have a lot of respect for all of the people that sit on these volunteer boards, including the HPC, the zoning board, and the planning board, because it's really an intense commitment and spending much more time on it than one would think. But planning, as we know, in terms of the urban environment, town planning, is a very important topic. And it is with the planning documents that we see the town take shape and then continues to take shape. And we see today what is going on. This is a beautiful postcard from the Montclair History Center of a Montclair that was about 100 years ago. So it's changed, as you can see, quite a bit since then. Yeah. All right, so planning and architecture experienced an epic shift at the turn of the 20th century. The industrialized cities of the 19th century had grown at a tremendous rate, with the pace and style of building largely dictated by private business concerns. The evils of urban life for the working poor were becoming increasingly evident as a matter for public concern. The laissez-faire style of government management of the economy in fashion for most of the Victorian era was starting to give way to new liberalism, also known as progressivism, that championed intervention on the part of the poor and disadvantaged. Around 1900, theorists began developing urban planning models to mitigate the consequences of the industrial age by providing citizens, especially factory workers, with healthier environments. And don't be alarmed, these are not pictures of Montclair at this time. These are pictures taken by Jacob Riis, who worked for the poor in New York City. And these are photographs that he took of the slum dwellings that were really widely broadcast and really brought about, he tried to bring about a change in the living conditions and the health conditions and the education of the immigrants and also other people that were reduced to living in this type of squalor. In the United States, this tradition of manipulating landscape began with the creation of Llewellyn Park in West Orange. The residents were not the slum dwellers that social reformers sought to improve their living conditions, but these people were socially upward families who sought the tranquil atmosphere of a planned park community. Designed by the developer Llewellyn Haskell and architect Alexander Jackson Davis, beginning in 1857, this planned community borrowed gardening traditions from England and transformed them into a distinctly American idiom. The dramatic or picturesque landscape is a dominant feature in the park. Carefully planned topography accentuates the terrain with elegant villas discreetly set into the landscape. Llewellyn Park and others in the United States were conceived as a therapeutic respite from the city, with curvilinear streets and irregularly shaped lots laid out in deference to the topography. Plans often provided for the retention of original trees and a natural system of setbacks, including recessed carriage roads, gatehouses, scenic drives, railroad stations, and village centers were a common characteristic of what is known today as the picturesque suburb. And I think many of you can recognize what still remains in Llewellyn Park. We have the gatehouse on the top left, this type of picturesque or fanciful house on the right, which was Jackson's house that was eventually torn down. But also the drives and the plantings are much the same as they were when they were first developed. Frederick Law Olmsted, the patriarch of the designers of Anderson Park in Upper Montclair, was greatly influenced by Llewellyn Park. His design philosophy for the park system in the United States is based in the theories of social reform. Olmsted also felt that nature provided a great remedy against the evils of the city. He advocated change both of scene and air for the populace, which would improve the physical, psychological, and moral health of individuals. He was a proponent of the wide landscape pleasure drive, which would afford not only an aesthetically pleasing route, but encourage interactive social activity. His theories came into fruition with his landscape designs for Central Park, which brought together a vast number of persons, poor and rich, young and old, Jew and Gentile. He felt that social interaction set within a beautiful environment would encourage a civil discourse between the classes. This philosophy was championed in the United Kingdom by Ebenezer Howard, who advocated a method of urban planning known as the Garden City movement. In 1898, Howard published Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform. Howard's ideas, although utopian, were also highly practical and were adopted around the world. His garden cities were intended to be planned, self-contained communities surrounded by parks containing proportionate and separate areas of residences, industry, and agriculture. His intention was to decentralize the working environment from the city center and provide a healthy living space for factory workers. And as you can see from these two publications, these were widely publicized and distributed in papers and other places. Additional developers of planned communities included Lord Lever, who viewed the social reform movement as contributing both to the alleviation of the poor's housing and environmental conditions characteristic of the larger towns, as well as to the positive creation of happy communities. This policy aimed to improve the conditions of those experiencing substandard housing and the restrictions of opportunity in the labor force. In Britain, planning developed with a particular emphasis on housing and concern for the community. And these are pictures of Port Sunlight, which was the planned community that he developed in England. On the top left, that classical building is the museum, the art museum, where he and his wife displayed the artwork that they had collected, paintings and sculpture and furniture, and it was open to the public, to the residents of the community. And in the other pictures, you can see the type of housing that was built to house the residents of Port Sunlight. And this was basically considered working housing because many of the residents, one of the industries that they had there was a soap factory. So right next to these houses was this huge soap factory. And if you've ever been downwind of a soap factory when it's going, it couldn't have been very pleasant. So on both sides of the Atlantic, the suburb denoted the meeting place of city and nature. It is the natural world of greenery and family life that appears to be separate from the great city, yet in fact, it totally is dependent upon it. At the turn of the century, cities experienced unprecedented crowding, with immigrants and citizens negating their country traditions. Yet cities are necessary. They are the setting for organizations, businesses, and services. Their symbiotic relationship with the suburb or the country is dependent on mutual interchange and commerce. The conveyance that became responsible for interaction between these two spheres was one born in the Industrial Revolution, and we're all familiar with this, the trains and the railroad. The form of transportation became crucial in moving people throughout urban and suburban areas. Another planning theory of the period, which had great ramifications on the physical appearance of cities and their surrounding suburbs, is known as the City Beautiful movement. City Beautiful advocates believed in transforming the urban environment. They hoped to eradicate the tenements and slums of the city into a more beautified, unified, and efficient arrangement of housing, civic, and commercial buildings interconnected with landscape streets. Gracing this noble cityscape would be appropriate architecture with a central civic center. This orderly environment would evoke the best values of civilization and offer its inhabitants a graceful and beautiful existence. Certainly one that's different from what's portrayed here. It was hoped that just as the bad urban environment brought out the worst in people forced to inhabit it, a grand one would encourage good and moral behavior and elicit the best from the population. City Beautiful advocates recognize that American cities cannot be mere show places, since urban areas were of necessity connected with commercial and manufacturing activities. They were convinced that attractive cities could function more efficiently than unattractive ones, and placed great confidence in the harmonizing potential of municipal art, expressed in parks or green spaces, wide boulevards and public gathering spaces graced with fountains and statuary. America's introduction to this radically new concept of city planning occurred in Chicago with the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Daniel Burnham supervised the design and construction of the largest World's Fair to that date. A team of distinguished American architects and landscape architects, including Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted, created a pleasure ground in the French neoclassical style. Under Burnham's direction, the construction of the fair overcame huge financial and logistical hurdles, including a worldwide financial panic and extremely tight time frame to open on time. Considered the first example of a comprehensive planning document in our nation, the fairground was complete with grand boulevards, classical building facades, and lush gardens. And you have to remember, these were only temporary buildings. They were only built to stand for a few months, and then everything was disassembled. So it's all sort of cardboard and stucco plaster placed on top. It was called the White City. It popularized neoclassical architecture in a monumental and rational Beaux-Arts style. Not only aesthetically pleasing, it incorporated the latest advancements in public hygiene, crowd control, electric lighting, and transportation. Hence the connection between the beautiful and the practical. And this is a contemporary print. You could see how large it was, and it covered acres and acres. And it was really quite an experience, if you can imagine, with the electric lights shining every night when cities everywhere was so dark. After this major success, Daniel Burnham in 1909 formulated the Plan of Chicago, which transformed the urban environment of that city. It was the first comprehensive plan for the controlled growth of an American city and an outgrowth of the City Beautiful movement. The plan included ambitious proposals for the lakefront and river and declared that every citizen should be within walking distance of a park. Sponsored by the Commercial Club of Chicago, Burnham donated his services in hopes of furthering his own cause. Though only parts of the plan were actually implemented, it set standard for urban design, anticipating future need to control unexpected growth. Now we turn our eyes to Montclair to see what John Nolen and how he was so instrumental in proposing some ideas, some which came to fruition and some which didn't. But Montclair, you can see these vintage images from turn of the century. And it was at that time, Montclair had 3 newspapers, gas street lights were placed on the principal corners, and the Montclair Railroad Company started to operate. In 1887, the Montclair Water Company organized with a total of 7 wells. The Montclair Military Academy opened. The Montclair Club formed in the remodeled Love residence on Church Street. In 1891, the first public library opened. Mountainside Hospital was founded, and the Young Men's Christian Association formed. The Montclair Athletic Club formed in 1893. In 1894, the township form of government commenced with Montclair divided into 4 wards, each with a councilman. Town Improvement Association was established. The trolley franchise was created by the North Jersey Street Railroad Company, and the Children's Home or Orphanage opened. In 1900, there were almost 14,000 citizens, according to the census, and the first Carnegie Library opened. In 1904, the Commonwealth Club of Upper Montclair organized, and in 1905, the council voted $100,000 to purchase 54 acres for parkland, with the Park Commission underwriting the bond issue to buy more parkland. The Montclair Civic Association, successor to the Town Improvement Association, organized. Montclair Mountaintop Hotel opened in 1907. In 1908, at a public dinner in March, the Montclair Civic Association appointed 2 commissions. They were the Charter Revision Committee and the Municipal Art Commission, who were charged to formulate a plan to make Montclair over into a model country town, and the State Normal School opened. During this time, numerous schools opened, the post office commenced service, and sewer and gas lines were laid. The civic-minded citizens of Montclair were certainly busy, the majority being men employed in New York and using the convenient railroad system for their commute into the city. In tandem with all this activity, we have the Montclair Art Colony, who established themselves in this town for the same reasons as the financiers and industrialists, the proximity to New York and the beauty of its natural landscapes. And many of these images are images from the Montclair History Center, which I thank them for. One of the Montclair's most enthusiastic supporters was a clergyman, Dr. Armory Bradford, pastor of the Congregational Church, 1870 to 1911. Much loved and respected by the citizens, Dr. Bradford was an author and keen observer of human nature and the natural and built environment. His calling allowed him to travel to England, where he preached at Oxford and Westminster. As superintendent to missionary, he also traveled to Japan and incorporated his impressions and philosophies into the many sermons he preached in Montclair. He was an unapologetic promoter of the many benefits of Montclair and its inhabitants. His introduction to a booklet called Picturesque Montclair appeared on the front page of the Montclair Times on May 1st, 1909. It would be hard to convince most residents of Montclair that any other city could compare with this mountainside, either in natural beauty or in the quality of the people who have here found their homes. He published a booklet in 1904 entitled The Third American City. You could see the frontispiece in the center there. In it, he predicted that a tunnel would open up under the Hudson River. And he also called the territory that we now call North Jersey, from the Palisades to Elizabeth, Bordered by the Hudson River and First Mountain, it comprised a continuous urban area of about 240 square miles with a population of almost 1 million people. He anticipated construction of, as I said, of a tunnel under the Hudson. He felt that the areas of residential suburbs and commercial centers were too diverse to become a single municipality, but a common interest would foster cooperation among these communities for a unified approach to transportation, water supply, lighting, and sewage. At the center of this image stood the residential suburban village of Montclair. So these were things that the movers and shakers of Montclair at the time were considering. They just needed to take a step forward. And part of the people that took on this mandate were the people who formed the Montclair Civic Association, which was the outgrowth of the American Civic Association, whose purpose was stated as the cultivation of higher ideals of civic life and beauty in America, the promotion of city, town, and neighborhood improvement, the preservation and development of landscape, and the advancement of outdoor art. The Montclair Civic Association was established in 1900. Its early incantation as the Village Improvements Association channeled their energies into the beautification of streets with major street planting campaigns. The socially conscious, financially secure, and civic-minded milieu thrived in turn-of-the-century Montclair. Its citizens were well aware of contemporary planning issues which dealt with urban and suburban issues. Montclair is recognized in the Suburban Life magazine of 1907 as Montclair the Beautiful, and praised for its beautiful homes, picturesque locale, good schools, numerous churches, its variety in civic and cultural organization. In fact, it states that in Montclair, there is a prevailing note of comfort and convenience. And these are some of the pictures that accompanied the article in 1907. Yet there was something missing. Montclair did not have a town hall or a civic center. It did not have an art museum. Its roads were logically placed with its main thoroughfare clogged with trolleys, horses, wagons, and pedestrian. The railroad station and their surrounding yards were not attractive. Blessed with a varied topography, proximity of transportation to New York, and a socially minded citizenry comprised of educated bankers, industrialists, and clergymen, Montclair sprang into action. The Montclair Civic Association held a meeting known as the Montclair Dinner at the Montclair Club on March 14th, 1908. I mentioned it before in this residence, which was stood on Church Street. At that time, they established two commissions, one being the Montclair Art Commission. This group, headed by William Dixon, Michel Lebrun, and Edmund Osborne, were charged with the selection engagement of a landscape architect. After careful investigation, they decided upon Mr. John Nolen of Cambridge as the best man, qualified by training and special experience in residential suburbs similar to Montclair. They had chosen the best, John Nolen. He was born in Philadelphia in 1869. He was orphaned as a young boy, and he was placed in Girard School for Orphan Boys. After graduating first in his class, he worked for the Girard Trust and eventually enrolled in Wharton School of Finance. Afterwards, he worked 10 years in the office of the American Society for the Extension of University Teaching. In 1903, he enrolled in the newly established Harvard School of Landscape Architecture and received his MA in 1905 and became a member of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Nolen had the connection with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. as his instructor at Harvard, and the work ethic to turn out multiple city plans, which were based on the planning theories of the City Beautiful, popularized by Daniel Burnham in the World's Columbian Exposition. His prestige as a city planner was established with the publication of 2 books and numerous articles, and he also gave the keynote speech to the first National Conference of City Planning in Washington, D.C. in 1909. And here are some of the sketches of plans that he did for various cities. The one on the top is Roanoke, Virginia. One on the right is Sarasota. And the one on the bottom is Schenectady, New York. Invited by the Montclair Art Commission to discuss his ideas about the improvement of the town, Nolen made his presentation March 22nd, 1909 at the Montclair Hotel, which you can see in this vintage postcard. And also the invitation to the meeting is also on the screen. The object of the commission was to promote the beautification of Montclair while preserving the distinctive charm of its country town quality. They were also concerned about the future development of the town, which up to this point had been haphazard and subject to the whims of individual landowners. They wanted to promote appreciation of arts and daily life and to encourage the patronage of private and public art. Members of the commission funded the entire study and paid for this presentation booklet, which Jane showed at the beginning of the talk, but it's a slim book that, I don't know, maybe it's about 14 by 7 inches. Here it is. And there's extra copies, many copies at the Montclair History Center if you'd like to go see one in person. But they paid for this presentation booklet. And here we see one of the 2 color sketches that were in the presentation booklet. These bound books were produced and delivered to every household in the township, again, at the expense of members of the committee. So I guess there's lots out there. I found mine on the internet. Recipients of the books were encouraged to join the commission, and a membership form was included in every copy. Of course, the frontispiece had a quote from Frederick Law Olmsted, and the first question is, will it be beautiful? It should be asked as any proposition for improvement, but it is not by any means the first question to be asked. Is it in purpose and tendency aiming in the direction we have deliberately chosen? Is it appropriate to that particular kind of common park, street, yard, or township, which we can reasonably look forward to having during the period in which the improvement will be effective? These were the questions that they were asking at the time, and very important if it was in the booklet. Here we have a half-page ad that was taken out in the Montclair Times in 1909. And in here, it gives some of the ideas that Nolen was proposing. In the booklet, he lists 20 different ideas how to improve the town, but here it only lists about 8. The design principles embraced those of the City Beautiful movement, and he was dealing with an established town plan because Montclair already was established with Bloomfield Avenue and many of the main streets. They included existing buildings and roads, but the picturesque and irregular plan, coupled with the natural resource of the area, led to certain age and mellowness, which he associated with the rural landscapes of England. He proposed to capitalize on this patina in the improvements he proposed to the committee in 1909. And Nolen did take an extended tour of Europe, spent a lot of time in England. So he experienced firsthand the buildings. He saw the light, he saw the materials and the different architectural styles that led such a variety to his thinking. In this study, he started with an evaluation of Montclair's resources, climate, and scenery. He then gave a brief appraisal of the existing facilities necessary for town life and proceeded to outline a plan which would secure additional features to add to the aesthetic and practical values of life in Montclair. As outlined in Nolen's plan and recommended by the Montclair Art Commission, his proposals included. Now, these are pictures that were actually in the booklet. It's interesting to see because there aren't many pictures of this type of thing available where you really see everyday life. So the pictures I've taken really come from the booklet. And you can see that he's proposing improving the railroad crossing and the station and the approaches to the station, because after all, this was the gateway to Montclair. So she thought it should be a suitable gateway and be an appropriate building, was a classical style of architecture. So one of the things that he proposed was to tear down the train station on the bottom left, which was standing. And what is there now was the train station that came to be. The other thing that's interesting is if you look at the center picture, that's the intersection of Bloomfield Avenue with the train track coming over it, and you could see the trolley lines crossing the train track. So he was really concerned with not only making it beautiful and attractive, but also improving the safety issues that were here, with all these people and horses and carriages crossing these tracks and the trolleys going up and down Bloomfield Avenue. One of the things he also suggested, and this is the second colored sketch that's in the booklet, is improve the six corners. The six corners was identified as Bloomfield Avenue, Church Street, Fullerton, and Glenridge Avenue. And what he was proposing to do is to open up on the north side where Glenridge comes up to the tops to create more of a plaza there, to create more room, more open space. And you could see here that the Church Street that would go off to the left at an angle, that still hasn't been developed with buildings. The church was still standing there. So it really was very much, much greener than it is today, but still the idea of congestion and lots of activity and many vehicles, whether they're cars or wagons and horses there. And one of the photographs that is in the booklet, which is on the left, is not Bloomfield Avenue, it's Fullerton Avenue, looking north. But you could see it was sort of a waiting area, a congregation area for the horses and carriages that were delivering things to the stores on Bloomfield Avenue. So today, where we have trucks dropping off merchandise in stores, which is a consideration that the planning board does have to look at that time, they had horses and carriages and the remnants of what horses were leaving in the street. So not only was it crowded, but it must have been a particularly smelly area to be in. He also was proposing improvements to streets. So this picture of a contemporary block in Montclair, he was looking at a more unified architectural style. And he was also looking to take away with the signage. You could see in that middle store, there's billboards, big sheets of paper, announcements just stuck to the side. So another thing which has come down through the century is signage, because I know we're very concerned with signage in Montclair. But South Mountain Avenue, which he considered one of the most beautiful suburban streets in the world, with its wide road and lined with trees and stately homes on either side. One of the improvements as I mentioned before, was that Bloomfield Avenue should be idealized with a comprehensive style of architecture. And Jane, this isn't it's an idea that has come down to us too. Jay mentioned the Teague studies that Mr. Teague devised to unify the storefronts of Bloomfield Avenue I thought it was the early 50s. Jane corrected me and said it was the late 40s, but it's the same concept that if things have a unified look, it presents a much better picture. So he does say on this picture on the left, which is from the booklet, about the special street problems in Montclair. And you could see that there are ramshackle buildings. The street is obviously a dirt road, and the trolley lines are running up and down. But he was a proponent. It's not that he was saying to take away with the trolley lines. In fact, he was a proponent of increasing the trolley lines in Montclair, because he thought it would do away, would not only help the population in transportation, but do away with a little bit of the clutter that was taking over Bloomfield Avenue and the ancillary streets. So he also was a big proponent of building restrictions about their setback, their height, and also the materials that they were being made of. And it's interesting, the photo on the left is an example of what he thought would be a good architectural model for what was being built in Montclair. And you could see it looks very similar to what we have now in Watchung Plaza and even some of the storefronts on Upper Montclair. The one on the right is something that he warned against Montclair. It was too high, too many stories, being 5 stories. He thought that a lower height would be better for this type of suburban country town. And it's interesting because it said from all these improvements, because this was lauded. I don't know where this was built, probably one of the Oranges, but if it's an improvement, he praised that Montclair be spared from this type of building. He also was a proponent of developing the Upper Montclair Business District. Again, the streets were dirt, trolley lines, cars, automobiles, and wagons and horses clogged the streets, although this was taken on a day that it didn't look very clogged. The Anderson Park was in existence, but the strip of land that is now the parking lot behind the stores on Valley Road, he recommended that the municipality buy that from the private owners, which they did. And it was turned into a park for a short amount of time, probably about 10, 15 years. But then it was turned into a parking lot, which we now know. And this isn't Montclair Plaza, it's the one behind Williams-Sonoma. He was also interested, as the proponents of the Garden City movement, in the improvement of playgrounds and parks. They were big proponents of fresh air and of different types of people, different classes of people coming together to enjoy a nice day out in the open air for both sanity and also health reasons. And one of the things that's really interesting, which never came to be, but which Frederick Olmsted also was a proponent of, and if you know the Emerald Necklace Drive around Boston, this is really the same type of concept called the Circuit Drive. So what he was suggesting was a drive that would go down up Mount Hebron, go down Upper Mountain, south to Cedar Road, and then go down into Glen Ridge and hook up with Ridge Avenue North, and then come back to Mount Hebron. And this would be used by, again, the newfangled automobiles, but also horse and carriage, and another way to get people out into the fresh air and get them moving. But this obviously never came to be. Working class housing. He was very concerned with the quality of housing that working class people were living in. And on the left in the booklet are some examples. I mean, these are very, very old Tudor houses. So, but it was the idea of the architectural style. On the right is a sketch of his that he did for worker housing in a planned city in Ohio. And you can see that it follows some of the architectural concepts with the roof lines and the windows, and also the idea that the church, the religious, would be very close to the residential, and also municipal government close to residential, which we'll talk about a little further on. And then he gives us an example of working housing in Montclair. And I don't think this exists anymore. It's clobbered. And I think it's probably been replaced by some of the brick buildings that are on Pine Street or Wheeler Street, or possibly even on Miller Street. So there was a move later on to improve the worker housing with a different type of material, which would be masonry. The one thing that he was really interested in and really wanted to see in Montclair was a proposed civic or town center. And that was also one of the tenets of the City Beautiful movement. This is the sketch that he proposed. And if you can consider that this would be Orange Road and this is Hillside, So that whole area that is across from the Board of Ed building, which, excuse me, if you go down there, drive there, it's a very flat area. So the topography wise, I think he realized it would be suitable, that there wouldn't be a lot of earth moving going on. And he was also concerned that the buildings that were along this street, where now those garden apartments are, were not suitable for a residential garden suburb as he envisioned. And if you look up on this map, which is a 1906 map, a Mueller map of Montclair, here is Orange Road, here's Hillside, here's where the fountain was. Now we have plantings, but it was this whole area here. So it was bordered by these streets, which are Trinity Place and Myrtle. So this is what he was suggesting be taken over by the town Civic Center, and it would be close to the churches. There's a church over here, is a little bit further, a couple of years further on to be built. But here was the high school. Here is the Board of Ed building, which was a school. The library was here, and then you have the two churches here, the Unitarian Church. And over here, it was the first to be built, again, a couple of years down the road, but I'm certain was in the planning stages, the municipal building. So it was his idea that there'd be sort of a concentrated area where people would be able to congregate, not unlike the Green, which was popular in New England, which came across from the Atlantic from England. So what happened here, and what actually happened, and why was this considered to be great in the beginning, in the planning stages, but when push came to shove, and the election happened, it wasn't voted. So the members of the commission, which had met at the Montclair Club, introduced into New Jersey a legislature bill, which was called the Town Plan and Art Commission Act. This would come before a special election of the Montclair voters. If it passed, the Montclair Town Plan and Art Commission would be formed. The commission would consist of 7 members appointed by the mayor and including the mayor. They would receive no salary, have no power to expend money, issue bonds, or make contracts. They would advise the council concerning town planning and improvements, and they would consult on the design and location of public buildings, parks, statues, and other outdoor works of art. The Nolen Plan would act as a guide. It was not legislation. However, the Town Plan and Art Commission Act would not become a law until it was adopted by the voters. So on Thursday, May 26th, Montclair voters went to the polls. However, the election was postponed by 1 week to give everyone the opportunity to have the information and make an informed vote. So they did a massive publicity campaign with handouts and also with informational meetings. So you could see here, 3 of them were planned, one at Hillside, one at the Commonwealth Club, and one at the Maple Avenue School. And through all this, a man by the name of Terrell wrote a letter to the Montclair Times. He attacked the persons involved with the Montclair Art Commission with the insinuation of future monetary corruption. He argued that the future of the township would be in the hands of too few with a limited view as to the growth and development. Part of his argument was based on the funding schedules proposed by the Montclair Art Commission, a combination of increased taxes and future bond issues. The editor of the Times responded, in addition to a number of individual letters. He countered with the argument that Montclair's future would be a partnership of public and private enterprise working harmoniously together to ensure a cohesive town appearance, as opposed to the irregular and piecemeal growth it had experienced. He maintained that the fresh proposition involving needed or advantage has always had bitter opposition on the part of a considerable minority of the taxpayers. He forecast that a mechanism for this type of planned growth would have to happen by necessity, either of this election or in the future. So you can see here that the seeds of planning are being talked about, and not only in Montclair, but throughout the nation and definitely within the state. So Mr. Terrell's scare tactics work, and Montclair's citizens defeated the bill by a landslide. And you can see here how many were for and how many were against. I mean, it really was a landslide. Of course, this being 1910, there was a huge portion of the population which weren't given a vote. So one wonders what would have happened if women who didn't get the vote until 1920 had been able to vote in this election. But throughout the controversy, Mr. Nolen was present in the township, explaining his suggestions, the timeline, the cost, and the models he drew upon both in the United States and Europe. At the end of the election, as reported in the Montclair Times, there was a meeting in the 4th Ward at the Maple Avenue School where Mr. Nolen was the chief speaker. He was heckled by the audience while explaining his plans and finally lost his temper at hostile audience members. Although Montclair did not adopt the plan created by Nolen, in subsequent years, some elements were deemed beneficial to the township. America's towns realized that one could not continue to develop without some vision of their future, and so planning boards were created with zoning restrictions. The Montclair Planning Board was created by municipal government in 1930 with the mandate to create a master plan, which would be updated every few years. And this is still in practice. It's interesting to note that the planning board was not created until 1930, but that was really at a shift in and a concern for what was being built on the state level. So New Jersey had established a Planning Enabling Act on June 7th, 1930, and it was really the same day that this ordinance appeared in the Montclair Times, which is still the ordinance that the planning board works with today. So once again, okay, so as the Nolen plan advised, improvements were made to the railroad stations and crossings. So what they did is the powers that be, whether it was the township mayor and councilman or the planning board, which was created in the 1930s, they did take some of the suggestions that Nolen had suggested. And one of the biggest things, I think the one that's the most evident, was the creation of the new Lackawanna terminal here on Bloomfield and Grove Street. And you could see from the Mueller map that I had showed you before that the train tracks were really placed very randomly with lines going haphazardly within that area. After this new terminal was considered and then built, the train tracks were in a much more easily and orderly fashion, and much easy to access and safer. They created the overpass on Grove Street so that one didn't have to go over those tracks that we saw in the picture that they showed. So it was a huge boost to create this. And this came along in 1913, very soon thereafter, the rejection of the Nolen plan by the Montclair voters. And over here, we have a booklet that was distributed by when the station was opened. So you could see that not only were they looking, they were anticipating the rise of the automobile, but and the use of the automobile going to and from the station, but little airplane in the sky and train, and also horse and carriages. So it really was a look to the future. And of course, all of this was encased in a classical building, which was the style that he advocated for grand, buildings, important buildings. The improvements to the streets occurred with the train lines and train tracks being either hidden or made it safer in their location. The Shade Tree Commission was established. That was soon thereafter, and I believe it was 1910. And on the left over here, is the proposal that Nolen, or the suggestions that Nolen had for the placement of trees and how trees should be used for secondary streets, residential streets, Bloomfield Avenue, and also the Circuit Drive that we had talked about before. Now we come to the Civic Center, or the Common, that was a big, actually a big part of his design, going back to the City Beautiful movement, and also what Olmsted had suggested. So we never got a town center, but we now have a arts plaza, which is, if anyone's been down there to walk around, it'll be interesting to see how this will be used in the future. We did get an art museum. Mr. Robert Evans donated his collection of artwork and created the museum that we know and love today. So it was this whole combination of the arts and open space, and being able for people of all classes to be able to enjoy these things that their principles were following. We do have a sculpture here on the right. This is a sculpture that's down at the Arts Plaza. So they're in a way trying to emulate what was talked about in these plans, but we still have a congestion problem. So the picture on the left is from the Montclair Times from 1970. This is the intersection of Elm and Bloomfield Avenue. And on the right, about 60 years prior, the horse and carriages with the congestion off of Bloomfield Avenue. But it's the same type of idea of congestion and trying to move many bodies, and how do you do that? Bloomfield Avenue, we have a low buildings, meaning 3 stories or lower, until you get up to the closer to the mountain, where it jumps up to 6 stories. Nolen had promoted this concept over here. He thought that the Crawford block was a good type of country town business building. Again, it's a low building, but it's varied. It has a lot of interest, and you can see it's not an English style building, but one with the stepped roofs that would be more of a Dutch variety. So with that, I'd just like to end this with a few questions that maybe people have been thinking about. As we go forward to the dawn, we're in the 21st century. We have different issues to address than the people 100 years before. Within the context of today's world, does the concept of City Beautiful have any relevance? Montclair is still a commuter suburb, but the concept of the picturesque suburb, does it still resonate today in the current Montclair? Do any of the aspects have a place in the Montclair of today? And the quote that I just would like to take from what Nolen wrote when he was promoting his plan is, if Montclair in the future is to retain the characteristic charm of the country town, rather than to become the commonplace small city in the country, we must very soon supersede the present haphazard method of development in which the attractiveness of the town depends almost wholly on private initiative, with a scientific town plan authoritatively applied and consistently adhered to. So thank you very much. If there's any questions.
We could repeat the one that was in the chat about Bradford Ave, in case people didn't read that. Someone asked, was Bradford Avenue named after Amory Howe Bradford? The Bradford School was, but not Bradford Avenue. Bradford Avenue was named after his father, who was also a minister.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, well, I had a comment many years ago. I was on the planning board, and we had to handle each application with without an overarching plan other than the 10-year, I think it was, or 8-year master plan, which didn't have to do with very little to do with aesthetics, but more to do with affordable housing and stuff like that. So my question is this: is there any chance given the current circumstances, of sort of going back to the past and trying to institute those type of recommendations that were made by Nolen or updated now, or are we now a developed suburban city rather than a beautiful country town, and we have to now deal with those issues?
I think you bring up a very interesting point. The planning board does work with their master plan, and they meet every few years to update it. It's not a set number of years. Usually it's around 7 years. It was just updated. Now we're facing different issues. We have a lot more people that not only in Montclair, but throughout the area, throughout the region. This is a very populous region. So yes, there is a tension between, and you could see it in planning board meetings, that people think that Montclair has become overdeveloped. And the only thing I would suggest is for people in the audience that are concerned about that to really make it a point to go to the planning board meetings and voice your opinion. It's very easy to do now because everything is virtual. You don't have to get dressed and go out, in the middle of the night on a cold night, and sit and wait for the public opinion part. If you go onto the Montclair Township website, you can see when the planning board meets, when the zoning board meets, and when the town council meets, and also when the Historic Preservation Commission meets. So you're able to voice your opinion there. And I have to say that after being involved for the past 4 years with, the different commissions and their commitment, they really do listen to residents. But if you're not vocal in the setting that people are able to hear this, meaning a public forum, then it just goes nowhere. So if it's interesting to hear that you were on the planning board, though. Are you still in local, or have you?
Oh, no, we live in Montclair.
Oh,
close to
okay.
50 years, but
Yeah.
no, it was interesting because this was back in the 80s. And the
Right.
difficulty we ran into, and I was chairman at that time, was that the emphasis was on individuals who would come in and plead their particular case against or before subdivision and other things of that sort that would come before the planning board as opposed to zoning. So there was never anybody who came in front of us on applications who were looking for an overall plan, or in other words, let's do something that will make Montclair look even more beautiful, and therefore would impinge upon individual property holders. So but again, and I don't know that there's any chance that that's going to go forward after, again, apparently, which is interesting, is the hotel development, which was opposed and that was granted, and seems to be in keeping in some sense, not that's my opinion, but it's not against my opinion, but sort of this is modern times, and we live in different times than what the Nolen plan had.
No, absolutely. And I have to tell you that not only that was the impetus for me to get involved with the HPC, that plus the talk I gave here, and somebody came up and said, why don't you get involved with the Historic Preservation Commission? So, but to answer your point, the master plan, there is supposed to be public input into the master plan, and there was public input into the master plan. I remember that clearly because I went to the meetings. So I think what your question is that if there is a groundswell of people that really go to these meetings when the next master plan is being looked at and considered, that perhaps we can turn it back. Now you're absolutely right. It would only be on an individual basis. And these redevelopment plans, when you go, people have become not only individuals, residents, but also members of commissions have become much more vocal in determining and really have had developers change their plans in terms of height issues and materials. You could see the difference between, you just referenced the hotel and also Seymour Street, what's being built on Seymour Street. So I just encourage public discourse at any and all opportunity.
I'm going to add one thing in there. And first, I just want to ask the question, is the Shade Tree Commission abandoned?
No, the Shade Tree Commission is, when we first moved here in the 80s, I was very involved with them because we had a number of issues they take care of the street trees. I think now the arborist, there was a problem then. What happened is that they had a problem with getting people to work as people went out on disability, they weren't able to climb the trees anymore. So the Shade Tree Commission, I believe, is somehow in the environmental tied up. It's with trees. I should have looked more into that, but the Shade Tree Commission, because trees were a major impetus and draw for people that moved here to Montclair. I don't think it's abandoned.
And I want to just mention, Kathleen, one of the things that a groundswell of support would help on right now is the little church on Glenridge Avenue. You want to just talk about that real briefly? Because we're running out of time, but I think it's worth mentioning it.
Yes, so on the next HPC meeting, which will be November 18th, we've received an application for demolition for what was called the Swedish Church on Glenridge Avenue, St. Eric's or St. Paul's Church. It had an active congregation up until the late 1980s. And then, as we all know, it sat abandoned for 25 years and now is in a very sorry state. A developer bought it and has done nothing to maintain the building and now wants to sell it. They tried to sell it by promoting it as the, okay, so sorry, Scott, thanks. They're now trying to sell it with the promise that it will be demolished and then they can develop on top of it. We are trying to save it. We're the Historic Preservation Commission. It has a long history in Montclair. I think it speaks about different immigrants that used it and loved the church with different congregations. And if anybody has anything that they can say to that, speak to that, please come to the HPC meeting on November 18th. And if anybody is in the audience today that has any bits of information that they could forward to me so that I could add it to our report, I would be really grateful for that.
Have they not explored any adaptive reuse of the building? Obviously, if the church is no longer a draw for a congregation, we've seen other churches, there's been adaptive reuse and they're now thriving as they've preserved the architecture and there's something else happening in there. There was never any attempt at that?
No attempt. And what they're saying, I don't know if I should even say this, but they're claiming that the damage to the church, the structural damage is too severe for it to be saved. However, it's their expert speaking against other experts. So it's a determination but you're absolutely right. If anyone's been inside, I was lucky to get inside about 8 years ago, and we
were together. Remember?
That's right.
We were on the same walking tour.
Yeah, I wish I had my camera then, but it's a great space and really such a relief to those high buildings that are going up on Bloomfield Avenue. I think it would be really it could be made a focal point, even though it's not a here I am big blowout building. So we're going to be looking at that on November 18th.
I only have a photo of the ceiling from that tour that
Oh,
I saw the other day, which was supposed to resemble a ship, because they were sea people.
right. Well, it was built by, I believe his name was Larsen, a Swedish carpenter. And they went on to have more, to create almost like a building empire in Montclair. I mean, they were very, very, good detailed carpenters.
Okay, everybody, if nobody else has anything else they'd like to add, we'll wrap it up. Remember, 2 weeks from today, we've got Montclair in the Ice Age, so really far back in time. And if you're coming to the afternoon program, remember it's 1 o'clock, not noon. So hope to see you then. Kathleen, thank you. Wonderful. And thank you for all your work.
Thank
on
you very
ECC as
much.
Well.
Nice
Thank
job,
you.
Kathleen.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night,
Take care,
everyone.
everybody. Good night. Stay
Good
safe.
night.